For this video, I'm going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into the item Reactive Barrier. I think Reactive Barrier is a really interesting item and probably a little bit underpurchased, so I thought I'd talk about it here. In the video, I'm going to explain how it works and what abilities trigger it. Then I'm going to compare it to another item that I think is pretty similar. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about when you should buy it and how you should use it. So what does Reactive Barrier do? Reactive Barrier is a tier 2 item that costs 1250 souls. It doesn't build into anything, and it's not built out of anything. It gives you some useful generic stats such as ammunition, HP and HP regen, in addition to the HP that comes from every vitality item. It also, most interestingly, gives you a passive effect that triggers once every 30 seconds. When this ability triggers is when you're affected by a select number of abilities and items, and it gives you a 400 HP bullet shield and a 200 HP spirit shield. These barriers last for 9 seconds. The next question is what abilities, items and such trigger the item? Now I'm showing a graphic on screen here of all the different abilities that trigger it. Abilities noted in red deal damage to you before the barriers apply. Abilities shaded in green deal damage to you after the barriers apply. There are also a couple items that trigger it. Knockdown and Curse both trigger it, and then a couple other weird interactions in the game trigger it too. So the ground pound stun from a walk will also trigger it, and interestingly, being parried triggers it too. So as a general rule of thumb, it's normally triggered by anything that we would consider CC, or crowd control. Something that stops you moving and using your abilities and attacking for a duration. Now, an interesting exception to this is Paradox's 3 Kinetic Carbine. For whatever reason, even though this stops you moving, it doesn't trigger it. The next group of abilities that also seem to trigger it is Forced Movement. Anything that forces you to move in a way that you weren't making your hero do. There is an exception to this too, which is Viscus's 3 Puddle Punch. For whatever reason, this doesn't trigger it even though it knocks you up in the air or in a direction. Lastly, I did also want to mention Lashes 1 is highlighted on the graphic. It only triggers Reactive Barrier when you have your point in level 2, which is to say, when it does a knock-up. This is consistent with it being a forced movement. Before that, it's just damage. In terms of when the damage is dealt, before or after the shield, this seems to be pretty inconsistent. I can't find any clear trend between the ones that do or don't. I think it's mostly just to do with how the abilities are implemented, whether the damage portion of them is before or after the kind of stun or force movement effect. Now, I think it's useful when looking at items that you compare it to other things that are similar. The most obvious comparison for Reactive Barrier is Divine Barrier. Divine Barrier is similarly a tier 2 vitality item that doesn't build out of anything. It also gives you health, but Divine Barrier instead gives you 8% ability cast range and 1 meter per second sprint speed. The active on Divine Barrier is quite similar to the passive effect on Reactive Barrier. It gives the target a 300 HP Spirit Shield and a 300 HP Bullet Shield, and this lasts for 5 seconds. The total amount of shields gained here is the same, although the allocation of them is a little bit different. Now, the other point here is that in addition to getting the barriers, Divine Barrier gives you a 2 meter per second move speed. Of course, the big difference between the two items is that Divine Barrier can be used on an ally, whereas Reactive Barrier is only for you and triggers automatically. So now looking at all this, I think it's good to discuss when I think you should be buying the item. I think Reactive Barrier is an item that is best purchased early, particularly in the laning phase. In the later portions of the game, the additional 600 HP is not going to be as consequential because you have more, and your positioning and ability to purge things like silences or slows off yourself is going to have a much bigger effect than just the raw HP of the barrier. Secondly, I think it's better purchased in solo lanes. This is because when you're in a dual lane, there are just 2 heroes to output damage onto you when you're stunned or slowed or whatever they've done to you. And because of that, the additional 600 HP is less likely to make the difference between you surviving or not. Now, the key factor is actually, what are your opponents in the lane? Because there are certain heroes that just really struggle to deal with it and really struggle to kill you once you have it. I think the key ones for me are Wraith and Moen Krill. Wraith's Sleep Dagger triggers it, and she really struggles to get into a good position to go on you without using it. She doesn't really have the burst to get through the 400 HP barrier unless you're already really low or out of position, and because of that, it's really good against her. Moen Krill also struggles to go onto you or deal damage without using his knockup, and because of that, they really struggle to get through the barrier. Moen Krill, while mostly doing spirit damage with abilities, has a good gun and will click you a lot, so you still get a lot out of that bonus HP. I do also think it's pretty good against Bebop, because it's triggered on both his uppercut and his hook. That being said, if you get hooked really out of position, that 600 barrier may not be enough to save you. I still think it's good against him. Now, in terms of how you play with the item, I think it's important that you remember that these barriers don't last forever. It's not like just gaining a 600 HP heal or something like that. It's a barrier that only lasts for 9 seconds. That means after you get these abilities, despite your instinct being, oh, I should run away, they've got on me, actually what you want to do is you want to fight back. You want to trade with them. You want to make them use their abilities, use their resources on clearing a barrier that you are already going to lose in 9 seconds, and in return get damage on them, damage to a building, or more of the CS. I think this is a really important point for how this item works, and if you think of it strictly as a save, you're not going to find it as effective. Leading off from that, Reactive Barrier is a selfish item. You're buying this item for you to make your laning stronger, to make your game easier. It's not like Divine Barrier, which you buy not just for utility to yourself, but also because it helps your whole team. Divine Barrier, I think, is good on heroes like Ivy, Paradox, some Dynamo and Calvin builds that are more focused on helping their team. Whereas Reactive Barrier, I think, is a lot better on the brawler heroes that get a lot out of the extra HP, want to go in and stay in, and tank abilities while they do that. These are heroes like Abrams, Mo and Krill, and McGinnis. The biggest consideration about what makes Reactive Barrier good or bad is the hero that you're playing against, or the heroes in the game. The more things in the game that are able to proc it, the better the item's going to be. And so that's the thing that I think you should be thinking about the most when you decide whether or not to buy it. I think the item is a little bit underpurchased at the moment because it is a really strong effect. Obviously, you need to think a little bit about whether you should be buying it or Divine Barrier or just some other combination of survivability items, but regardless, it's still really useful. Thanks for watching the video, and remember, like and subscribe and do all that good YouTuber stuff. Thanks.